Good morning. It's really good to be here. So I'm going to tell you stories, and the reason I want to focus on stories is because both you get information from stories, but I think they also can be a source of inspiration. So I'm going to aim for your head, but I'm also hoping to reach your heart and bring us back to the reconnection that we need with nature and with each other. And seeds are an embodied story. So I hope you're going to go away today with a completely different understanding of the role of seeds, and also maybe stories and how we connect with each other. Why seeds? Because, people think, well, we need air, we need water, we need land, we need sun. But people forget how important seeds are. I call it the fifth dimension, It's sort of an invisible world. But seeded plants provide us with our food, we know that. But they also provide us with fuel and fiber and medicine. And seeded plants even provide us with the air we breathe. But they're pretty invisible to us, and so we take them for granted. I hope to make that apparent today about how important they are to our world. Now I'm going to get started really early on, back to, before I do this, I'm sorry. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and why I care so much. I come from a long line of plant-loving women. My mother and my sisters are gardeners. One sister was a professional horticulturist, and we've always been involved in growing things. But in my work as a lawyer, I represented traditional native healers who also, this is me with Florence Jones, who was a Wintu healer. In their tradition, they studied plants. She studied plants for 38 years before she began her healing. So we don't have that kind of tradition in our medicine of such long, intense study. But she did that, and I learned a lot from her about their plants. And also in my work as a journalist, I've been covering plants, and I've been actually studying and reporting on GMOs for almost 20 years. So we'll be talking about all of those things. And during that time, I've had one very core value, which I want to share with you, and that is this inherent integrity of the natural world. And that's why I was so concerned about GMOs and other technologies. There's more online coming down the pipe. They're even worse than GMOs, I'm sorry to say. But they all are affecting not only our personal health, but our planetary health. So I want to take us all the way back to a very early story, the Garden of Eden, probably one of the best known creation stories from the biblical book of Genesis. And we all know about this garden, or most of us do, where there's this harmony in nature and where animals and people get along and there's all this abundance. And like most creation stories, there's a catch. All of them have a little thing where people are supposed to do something right, and then they don't do it, and then they pay the price. So it's always really interesting what happens. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to come back to what really happened in that particular story. But just remember that this narrative has a lot to do with how we think about the natural world and our place in it. In this story, of course, we're told that Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, and that then we have to feed ourselves by the sweat of our brow. So I want to just emphasize that we have this negative idea of ourselves and how we feed ourselves that comes from this story. Maybe there's another way to look at this. Also, the book of Genesis refers to 4 rivers in the Middle East. Now, there are a lot of places in Bible stories that are actually located in the Middle East, and you can find them. And satellite data and biblical scholars have narrowed down this area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers to an area, probably most likely the one in southern Iraq, which was a moist and fertile valley thousands of years ago. And this area is also known as the Fertile Crescent. Now, we know that agriculture arose all over the world in different places. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But everywhere in the world, like in the Americas, there's corn, rice from Southeast Asia and Africa, and all these other places where people and plants engaged and domesticated the plants and animals that give us our food supply now. That we count on now. These are places called the center of origin. And in the Middle East, the center of origin is for about 83 different species. Nuts like dates, lentils, peas, rye, wheat, and beans, apples, pears, and a lot of spices and medicinal plants. They all originated in the Middle East. Iraq, in particular, has a priceless seed heritage. So in the 1970s, the Minister of Agriculture of Iraq went all over the Middle East and collected these ancient seeds. 1,400 different accessions of unique varieties from all over the Middle East were collected. And the Iraqi Ministry of Agriculture established a seed bank in an area right outside of Baghdad, and a breeding plant center and a botanical garden. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, we destroyed the seed bank and we destroyed the plant breeding center and the botanical garden. Now, fortunately, a few scientists smuggled out of Iraq a cardboard box with just some of the seeds that were in the seed bank, these ancient, precious heritage seeds. But unfortunately, they took them to Syria, and so they're still at peril of being destroyed because of the war in Syria. So this story also illustrates the vulnerability of seed banks to conflict zones and other problems. And it's also important because it tells us about the link between the war and agriculture, which I'll get into in a second. The location of the seed bank, though, is a place that you probably have heard about. It's Abu Ghraib. That's where the prison was as well. It's an area of great shame in American history. According to the United Nations FAO, before the United States invasion, 97%, almost 100% of Iraqi farmers saved their own seed or bought them at local markets. So Iraq was seed independent before we invaded in 2003. But we destroyed that too. L. Paul Bremer, remember him with the suit and the boots and that guy? He spent $12 billion of our money in the first year of the U.S. occupation, $9 billion of which has never been accounted for. And I tell all these stories in my book. But basically what happened was that he wanted to reform agriculture in Iraq. And to do that, he also appointed a Cargill executive. Cargill's a big multinational grain company, to reconstruct the agriculture of Iraq. And basically what they were doing was making the Iraqi agriculture, which had been self-sufficient and seed independent, they turned it into the kind of agriculture we have in the Midwest. So that they created a dependency on Iraqi farmers on U.S. seed supply and other inputs and to sell their wheat on the international market. So this ongoing worldwide destruction of traditional agriculture is also largely invisible. This is one of the dirty secrets of war. It's linked to food systems. I saw this firsthand in Vietnam, where rice was a major part of the U.S. war and occupation in Vietnam as well. So the whole point is who controls seeds. In Iraq, of course, there's the oil and energy, water. These are all the heart of the conflicts going on around the world. And agriculture is a big part of that because, and this is something I'd like you to remember, if you want to control the food system, if you want to control a population, you can control their seed supply. You would control your seed supply if you could, if we let them. In Iraq, this was also done by imposing a new law, commonly known as Order 81. It was written by U.S. companies and U.S. agriculture policy, and it basically restricted the use of seeds by Iraqi farmers. They had to buy their seeds, and it imposed hybrid and U.S. seeds on the Iraqi agriculture. You can look it up, Order 81. How did we get from the Garden of Eden to Abu Ghraib? How do we go from this sense of abundance and harmony in nature to the kind of cruelty and power struggles that we're seeing now in the world? You know, we're really facing a very perilous time in the world today. And the United Nations has estimated that 60% of all the biological functions on Earth are seriously degraded. So we're facing some really very difficult decisions, not only in ourselves as people, but as a country and as a society. So how do we know if we're headed in the right direction? This slide illustrates some of the perils that we're facing right now. Just to summarize, we have increases in population. We've got decreases in natural resources. We've got climate change. We've got the loss of species. These are very serious threats to our well-being. And yet our response to this has not been really adequate. And one of the things I've studied as an environmental journalist is why aren't we taking effective action in dealing with these problems? One of the reasons I discovered was the way we're given information. Now, these two slides represent the kind of confusing information around climate change. It's just for instance. There's a lot of data like CO2 and, it's very abstract and it's very distant and things that are happening in other places. And I agree, I like this information. I work really hard to try and translate that information into stories that help people see the world the way it actually is functioning. I also happen to agree with this representation of Monsanto. I think it's really quite accurate. This is who they really are. But these are very distancing and they're fear-based. And they create what psychologists call denial and distancing. They create this kind of information when you supply it to people, you create fear on their part. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can say that's done on purpose. But I think a lot of it is actually just done because people don't have a better way of talking to each other about the world we're living in and the threats that we face. So how do we make the right choices? How do we figure out where we should be headed? Okay, now these are two extremes. One is the abundance and biological world of healthy soil and clean water and good, communities. And the other is this sort of technological, I call it biological versus biotechnology. The two choices, they're extreme, and there's a big gray area in the middle where people make good choices and where a lot of us are in transition to try to transition to a more biological basis. But there's also a lot of effort to force us into technologies as the answer, the techno fixes. And if you really look at what technology has brought, especially in terms of agriculture, it's these large monocropping of GMO seeds and chemically dependent agriculture that we see, that we have now. So one thing I learned living in Vietnam is that people know how to deal with adversity and hardship. And the main thing that I saw there that I don't see so much here is the cooperation of people and communities. Surviving together and having a sense of community and reliance on each other is vital. You saw this with Katrina, you see this when disasters happening. People turn to each other on the local level. And in terms of the food system, this is what we know as the culture of agriculture. Okay, I always like to say that when you take the culture out of agriculture, all you have left is agribusiness. So part of my work is to return culture to agriculture, to put the people back in, to put the purpose back in, which is to feed people. It's fundamental. The other thing that I learned in Vietnam was the importance of rice. And I had been practicing law almost entirely when I closed my law practice and moved to Vietnam with my husband, who was in the rice business. And American Rice and the government of Vietnam went in together to help the Vietnamese with their rice business in the post-war period where there was still some starvation and scarcity in Vietnam. And it was very interesting. And I had an organic farm on the Mekong River. And I hired a water buffalo and we cleared out the area and I got to know the women of the area and I started teaching them about planting. I had to work really hard to find seeds and to find inputs that were organic because most of the area around me was industrial rice cultivation. And I really enjoyed doing that, and I would invite the village women over to the area where I lived and feed them from the garden and show them about how to grow their home vegetable gardens without using the pesticides, because these women work in the fields. I don't know if you know this or not, but in most of the world, agriculture is something that women do. They grow food for their families and their communities. In some places in Africa and Southeast Asia, 85% of agriculture is women labor. So they often will work in the commercial agriculture, and they bring home the pesticides. And in Vietnam, the pesticides weren't regulated or labeled. There was no instruction. So I would go around and I took a little survey, and some of them said, "Oh, we spray all the time. We spray as much as possible." And I go, "Oh no, this is not a good idea." It was, I was concerned about the water and the effects of pesticides, and I saw also the damage of Agent Orange that was used as an herbicide in the war. But mainly, it was actually quite an effort to put together some kind of a way for them to feed their families without having the sprays that they use to take home. But I spent a couple of years at it and was eventually successful. But it's like everything else that you do. When you do the right thing in the places where you live, there's a gift. And the gift to me was I learned about rice and the generosity of this important grass. What I think people don't know is that most of the world's food supply is grasses. Corn is a grass, wheat, and rice are the three main foods of the world. And rice really taught me a lot about the culture of agriculture. These grasses are extraordinarily generous to us. I learned that in Vietnam alone, there were 10,000 varieties of rice. There are probably over 100,000 worldwide. Some of these varieties of rice grow. Vietnam is a water world, and the floods come in, and these rice know how to grow taller and taller and taller as the water comes in. There's also drought resistance and pest resistance. And like I said last night, all that genetically modified organisms is stealing some of these wonderful gifts of nature, that the adaptation that these plants have done to their natural world, and take them and patenting them and using them and selling them back to farmers. I'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit. But rice is the kind of sacred food like corn, where it connects people to the places they live and it connects to each other. I saw farmers, for instance, in Southeast Asia, and they'd plant those commercial rice varieties like kamwali. I don't know if anybody's ever had that, very nice, fragrant rice. They plant that because they have to make a living, and then they'd plant some really special rice for their families a little bit, and then over in one little corner they'd plant some sacred rice and ceremonial rice. So I realized that there's way more to this growing food than I had seen before I lived in this particular area. Again, it's all about the culture of agriculture. And these seeded grasses and their generosity and our relationship to them have been feeding us all along, and they still do. So the importance of seeds. Seeds have always been important. As the poet Howard Nemeroff says, they're the original monies of the earth. The sharing and exchanging of seeds is not only an inextricable part of the food system, but it's also part of local economies. I'm going to talk about how this is coming back into our lives now, but it's been part of us for 10,000 years. It's how we live on Earth. We're a seeded planet, and we're seed people. And of course, seeds are the common heritage of humanity. This crucial heritage, this is why I chose to write my book on seeds. Instead of just talking about, I care very much about all these issues of science and technology and the corruption, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But seeds, to remember something as sacred, to remember our connection to the plant world and how important it is to us, I think is such an important part of telling the story of how we got here. What happened? Why did we go from being healthy, growing food locally, to where we are now, where we're eating mostly corporate food and genetically engineered food, and food that's been, raised with pesticides? How did we get here? That's what I'm trying to get across, is what you need to know about this. And seeds are one great way to tell this story. Now, there are probably 150,000 edible plants in the world. And like I said, there are basically 3 or 4 that feed most of us, the corn, wheat. Now soy, of course, is important. But of all the thousands and thousands of edible foods that we've enjoyed over the years, 70% 75%, actually it's closer to 80%. In the first part of the 20th century, the first couple of decades in the 20th century, we started this narrowing of the genetic diversity of seeds that we use in the food supply. And we have fewer and fewer. We used to have like 800 varieties of apples grown in the United States. And now there's maybe a dozen and just a few green and red, in the supermarket. So there's this narrowing of the genetic diversity in the food supply that's a really crucial part of the story. Actually, by some estimates, it's more like now 90% of the genetics of seeds, the genetics of plants that are valuable to people are gone. So one of the biggest causes, one cause that I don't mention here is loss of habitat and the eradication of farmland. And that's something that we need to look at as well. But basically, the main cause is seed consolidation, ownership by corporations. In 2011, when I first started using these slides, it was 10 companies owned 75%. And when I did the research for this talk, it's now down to 6 companies that own 75% of the world's, they control the sales of seeds in the world. These companies buy up all the little small seed companies, and they're not just buying the sales or the products, they're buying that germplasm, they're buying the libraries, and if it's not commercially available, they no longer will sell or keep that seed. So we're literally losing one of the most precious gifts of the earth and the planet. Now, I don't know if you've heard, but Monsanto and Syngenta are considering a merger. And this information I get is from the ETC group in Canada. And if those two companies are allowed to merge, they'd control 54%, this one company, 54% of the world's sales of seeds and the related research and development. Again, they get to choose what seeds we have, what is grown, and what we know about it. And they also then would do what they're doing now, which is raising prices and forbidding farmers from saving the seed themselves. The other thing I want you to notice about this slide is that these are all chemical companies, agrochemical companies, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. Let's stay with the seeds and the genetics for a minute. Seed banks are a very crucial part of saving the world's heritage of seeds. On your left is the Arctic Seed Bank. You probably heard about that in Svalbard. It's a backup seed bank, saving seeds from other seed banks. So seed banks take part of their collection and then send it to the Svalbard in order to back up that supply in case there's a world catastrophe. But as I mentioned before, seed banks are really vulnerable. They're vulnerable to war, conflict, flood, natural disasters, but they're also very poorly funded. Here in the United States, we're defunding our very precious seed banks. And with that comes also the loss of knowledge. One of the fun things I did when I wrote my book is I got to go seed banks. And I'd walk into these great rooms, like this room here, and it'd be all quiet because there's this refrigeration, it's cold and quiet. And it was just like walking into a cathedral. I could just feel this vitality of these collections and how precious and sacred they were. It was really an amazing experience. And yet, one of the things that has to happen, I also saw, is that you have to grow out these. These are living organisms. All seeds are living organisms. So you have to grow them out repeatedly, make sure they germinate, get them back into the collection, and there's always a loss of germplasm when you go through that process. The other thing that's very important to understand is that very few seeds are actually good to store in cold storage. So not all the plants that we love and care about can be stored in seed banks. So what are we going to do? So on-farm seed saving, botanical gardens, and other places where they save seeds, what they call in situ, in place, are crucial to saving the seeds of the world. This is back to farmers again. They have an enormously important role. The other thing that they do when you grow seeds out on the farm and exchange them is you're developing the local adaptation of these plants. So as the climate changes, as drought comes about, you can adapt the crops that you grow. I do this in my own garden. I have lettuce that I've been growing every year, and I watch how it responds to different water and temperature changes. And, and I go, well, they'll save these seeds. It's just it's been this intimate relationship with seeds we've always had. It's really actually fun. Even if it's just a little pot on a windowsill, I encourage you to get involved in plant growing because it's part of who we really are. The other thing that's really important about local seed saving is the local knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge of native people, and again, native people are are vulnerable, just like seeds are vulnerable, and their knowledge, the information that they have for thousands of years, in some cases, is also disappearing along with their languages. And also, one of the things I want to mention about this, there's this farmer-to-farmer information. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Hawaii, but the other thing that's very important is to encourage the ability of farmers to talk to each other. Again, what we're saying is this expertise that the companies are trying to establish as Monsanto as the expert, we know how you should grow what you need to grow. Farmers know what they need to know, and they need to be able to talk to each other, and also not just locally, but internationally as well. This communication among people is, again, a part of the culture of agriculture that we need to preserve. So I've been asking this question, how did we get into this mess? How did we get to where we are now? And I'd like to focus on corn. It's a gift. They call it a gift. Many corn cultures call it a gift to the Americas. And I think the story of corn is another story that helps tell the story of who we are and how we got to where we are. Corn's center of origin is Mesoamerica. And the people in the area call themselves, like in Guatemala, call themselves the children of corn. And it's actually, what's interesting, one of the things I love about science is it keeps validating what we know in our hearts to be true. And we are the children of corn. We are corn, if you live in a corn country like America. And there was a biologist at UC Berkeley who tested the human hair of corn and found that 69% of the carbon in that human hair came from corn. And I mentioned earlier the Wintu people, we talk about, they're a salmon culture. Did you know that there's salmon genes in the redwood trees in Northern California? Because the bears eat the salmon and they take it up to the trees. So this food system is a food web. It's part of who we really are. It's not just something out there. It's an intricate and intimate relationship. We know a little bit about how corn came to be. We don't know actually exactly yet in the genetics of it. The small little area on your left is teosinte, which is Nahuatl for the grain of the gods. Again, reaffirming this idea of the gift. We don't quite know much more than the teosinte and other grasses that came into corn as we know it, or maize, which is the way it's known in most of the world. But the origin stories, again, the creation stories of the people of corn have great explanations for how it happened, including that lightning hit it. That makes a lot of sense, actually, because when they were first making genetically engineered seeds, they were literally bombarding it with radiation to try and mutate the genes. So, it's really possible that these stories have some validity in science. We don't really know, but I'll tell you, here's the shocking truth about corn. Oh, and I just wanted to mention that this sort of, it looks like a struggle between these two guys, but I use it to illustrate the dance between people and plants, because out of that is what comes these important foods. I think of it as a dance that we do between us and the plants. But here's the real truth about corn. Corn is supported by almost $6 billion a year in annual subsidies in the U.S. And that doesn't include public road and water infrastructure or crop insurance. Crop insurance alone in 2012 was $20 billion. It's really important to understand that GMO corn, and 85% of corn grown in the United States is GMO, that this is a chemically dependent crop and it's subsidy dependent. Without these subsidies, we wouldn't have GMO agriculture, which is why I'm a great advocate of changing our farm bill and our farm policies to eradicate these production-based and chemical-based subsidies. I think farmers do need support, but we could support them as they do in European countries for conservation and for going organic. In the Netherlands, for instance, they have targets, and they say, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but 5 years from now, the water's not going to have any more herbicides in it. You figure out how to do it, and we'll pay you every year for doing that. Use a yardstick. So they're farmer-friendly ways to support farmers, but also come out with a completely different vision for agriculture. Corn is a big source of the dead zone. All the atrazine and herbicides that are sprayed on corn go down into the rivers, and they flow into the Mississippi and go into the Gulf. Do you all know about the dead zone? Basically, what happens is there's so much fertilizer and so much the chemical conditions of the water creates a dead zone, meaning nothing lives, and it's larger than the area of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico, where nothing is alive, nothing lives, no shrimp, no life forms at all. It's dead because of all the runoff from the fields in the Midwest from this agriculture. And atrazine has been found in most streams. That's one of the herbicides that's used. And we talked sometimes about, when we talk about GMOs, we talk about the overspraying of herbicides, and I'll get into that. But the biggest danger I'm hearing about now is this new 2,4-D corn. Well, I mean, it's called 2,4-D. 2,4-D is an ingredient of Agent Orange, and it's being mixed with glyphosate and other herbicides and sprayed on corn. It was approved by the USDA without any testing. And you don't know about it, right? You weren't given a voice in this. And dicamba, which is another really seriously toxic pesticide, again, it's being used. In terms of the delivery of food, we have this myth of the productivity of U.S. agriculture. In terms of food for people, these large monocropped, chemically dependent GMO cornfields only produce enough food per acre for 3 people, which is less than farms in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Okay, so this is not about feeding people. How is it used? Corn is now a machine. It's considered a machine. 40% of it is used for ethanol, which is also highly subsidized. So you subsidize the farming and you subsidize the ethanol. 36% of it is animal feed, so that's over 75% of this corn is going into animal feed and ethanol. We're feeding cars, we're poisoning the animals. It's also used for a lot of other industrial products and for experimental crops, like even birth control has been genetically engineered into corn so that it could be used in industrial animal facilities. And only a tiny fraction of corn is being used for human food, and that is a lot of high fructose corn syrup. And if you care about your health, you probably know how dangerous high fructose corn syrup is for your diet. And it just keeps getting worse. We have corn in all these products because it's an industrial system. So now this is an industry. And again, you see that 100 years ago, corn was owned by American farmers. They owned their seed, they traded their seed, they got income from selling their seed, they adapted their crops to their local area, they were seed independent, and they actually could make a living. And as the century turned in the 20th century, American farmers were both productive and economically independent. And now 95% of corn is owned by agrochemical corporations. So once again, I'd like to ask the question, how did we get from corn as sacred to corn as a commodity? It's like that proverbial frog in the boiling water. It's come about very slowly, and it's come about without us really knowing it's happening, because that's actually part of what industrial agriculture does not want you to know. So if you read the advertising, remember ADM's advertising, we feed the world, right? No, we don't. No, we don't. So the advertising wants to sell you a story that's not true. So I'm hoping to give you some truth about what's really happening in agriculture. The other part of it is the corruption in government that allows this to happen. We don't determine our agriculture policy. I was a lawyer for the USDA. As I mentioned last night, it was actually during the Carter administration. I hate to reveal how old I am, but back then it was really a time where you could do public service. I probably wouldn't have gone into government except for there was an opportunity to serve people, and there was still that sense in government that people could take care of the health of the land, and we could take ourselves seriously as a country. And then when Reagan was elected in 1980, everything changed. Everything changed. And there was this deregulatory, government is bad, and I left government service and went into the work I'm doing now. But what I realized is that we'd lost our voice. We've lost our minds, we really have. We don't even have control over what we think anymore. But we've lost our voice in the political system. And so the political aspects of this, I think, are very important for us to be paying attention to. I'm going to tell you one more story about corn that I think illustrates this problem. This is Senora Maldonado. She's a traditional Zapotec farmer in Mexico near Oaxaca. I met her when I went there to report on a story that was about to make international news about the rampant genetically modified corrupt contamination of corn. I was food and farming editor at KPFA, a Pacifica radio station in Berkeley, near UC Berkeley, and a scientist there came by one day to see me. His name was Ignacio Chapela, and he told me that he had just discovered genetically modified organisms in the traditional criollo corn. Criollo is the word that traditional Mexican farmers use for the local varieties that are this. Now, remember, this is the center of origin of corn. Okay? This is the precious seed heritage for one of the most important crops in the world, and now it's been contaminated with GMOs. It was a shocking story, and I have to tell you, I burst into tears. It was so sad to think that we would lose this, that that the farmers and the seed, both these farm fields would be contaminated. Now, the biotech industry, when this story came out, said, oh, I know what happened. Farm workers thought this was such a good idea. They put some seeds in their pocket and went back to Mexico and planted them in their fields, making themselves look good and the farmers look bad. But of course, that was absurd. What's important to know is what the real culprit was, and that was NAFTA. We talk about these free trade agreements. We just had another one passed. And there, if you remember one thing, free trade is not fair trade. Okay? The purpose of these international free trade agreements is to impose corporate control over whatever it is, software, seeds, whatever trade, to reduce local sovereignty, to reduce local choice, and to bring, American companies or other people into the economics of that area. So what happened under NAFTA was Mexico had to agree to take feed corn from the U.S., and feed corn, as you now know, is all genetically engineered. And because of the free trade agreements, the local corn economy in Mexico had been basically destroyed. So I talked to farmers who said the price of their corn was so high compared with this corn coming in from the U.S. that they couldn't compete. Thank you. They couldn't compete with that. So in the little local stores, they had these big sacks of corn that were unlabeled. Nobody knew whether it was GMO or where it came from or anything, just big sacks of corn for a lot less money. Well, of course farmers are going to buy it. Of course they're going to plant it and use it. So like Order 81, these laws basically force the system that I've been talking about onto farmers and onto consumers. And it also proved that genetically modified organisms are very highly interactive in the environment they're in. Olga told me that she was really concerned because she feeds her children from this corn, criollo corn she was growing, and it had BT in it. And they were also noticing that lack of BT in farmers' fields all over the world. You have fewer birds, fewer butterflies, fewer insects. It stays in the soil and contaminates the soil for many years. You have a lot of problems for farmers. So it wasn't just that one crop she was worried about. She was worried that she would be put out of business as a farmer as well. And then here's the kicker of the story. As soon as this story came out, the industry went into high gear and trashed Ignacio Tapella. They went after him big time, both personally and professionally. Now, eventually, as with all the stories of the scientists who've been attacked by the biotech industry, all the independent scientists who come out with information that's critical of GMOs are attacked by the industry, and that's almost all people really remember. Oh, that story, it wasn't any good. But most of these stories, including the GMO stories of corn, have been validated. The studies have been repeated, and indeed, the contamination has occurred and is now more widespread in Mexico at the center of origin of corn. So how do we restore integrity to this system? And one of the things that I think is most important is to restore the role of traditional farmers in these areas of center of origin and center of diversity. Their knowledge, their seeds, their practices are a vital part of the food system we all depend on in the world. I'm trying to get a mix here of the humanity involved as well as the political and the corruption. It's kind of hard to sustain when you think about what are we going to do about this now? How do we care about the seeds, care about nature, care about farmers, and also live in the world of this enormous corruption of science and politics? How do we fix this system? So let's talk about GMOs for a minute, because I think that's going to illustrate another part of the problem that's important. I don't want to spend a lot of time in it. There's a lot of information online in my book and the books that other speakers at the conference have here about the myths of GMOs. But it's very important to understand that most of what you're told in public relations and in the media, as a journalist, I can say this with certainty, is not true. Very seldom. So you here at this conference are very lucky to be able to get accurate information and good science about the truth about GMOs. So I'm going to pull back the veil that sort of covers this. I mentioned this last night and somebody said they appreciated it, so I'll repeat it. And that is that as a journalist, I know what happens in the newsrooms. And what happens is these public relations documents get on the journalist's desk and they're just repeated. They're not evaluated. They don't do any research. You're just getting what the companies are telling you. You're not getting independent reporting anymore. Journalism has basically abandoned that obligation. Genetically engineered foods. It's an industrial product for an industrial system. These are agrochemical companies. If you remember one thing about GMOs, remember it's all about these chemical companies and the chemicals that they use. Either they engineer a plant to withstand being sprayed repeatedly by herbicides, toxic herbicides, or they put the insecticide into the plant itself. So when you eat them, you're eating not only genetic constructs, which have been untested and are unstable, you're also getting the residues of the pesticides on the plants, or you're getting the insecticide itself because it's been genetically engineered to constantly be active in that plant. When you spray an insecticide, it can degenerate, okay? And you might use them in your home and garden. I hope you don't, but you do have a time period when it goes away. Genetically engineered insecticidal plants don't. They're engineered to stay active constantly and in all parts of the plant, the leaves, the seeds, in the roots, in the soil. It's still alive. The process is unstable. They don't know what they're doing. There is precision when they select the genetic constructs that they want to use, but once they put together a little cassette of all these designer genes and they insert it into the plant, they use a gun, 22 caliber gun, or they use a virus or bacteria to insert it in. So it's kind of a violence in itself. They have no idea where it goes in the genome. I've seen pictures of mutations and plants that have been genetically engineered, the ones that get discarded, that are horrifying. And the way they know if it worked is they use an antibiotic-resistant marker. So you're getting antibiotic-resistant genes in your food as well. That's a problem, and they're in the environment, and they're in the waterways. They use that and they put an antibiotic on it, like tetracycline or streptocide. It's one of the general antibiotics. And if the plant still survives, the gene survived, they go, oh, okay, that's a gene that's working. And then they grow thousands and thousands of them out. And if it looks like corn and acts like corn and walks like corn and talks like corn, it must be corn. And they do this purposefully. They discard thousands and thousands of these experiments, and then they clone the one that looks and acts the way it's supposed to. So it's all accidental. They just hope for the best thing. 1 out of 10,000 will work, and they clone that, and they turn that into their product. And when they talk about there's the most studied in the world, they're talking about this other aspect of it. And they're not, once it's been cloned and ready to go to market, they don't pay attention to how it affects you and your health. They don't pay any attention to what happens in the environment when it's being grown out. None of that is of consequence. Never been tested, never been studied when they were first marketed. And I was involved with this issue right at that time in the 1994, 1995 time period. And we said, no, you can't do this. Nature has a way of responding to these threats. You're going to be able to have insects that'll have resistance to this Bt corn. You're going to have weeds that'll be resistant to the herbicides, and we're going to have super weeds. And now, in fact, all of these things have come true. And I just want to mention, because I'm a farmer advocate, that these companies restrict the use of these seeds and use of these chemicals. And as was mentioned last night, farmers don't buy seeds anymore. They rent them. They only get them for a year. They can't save any of the seed. They're restricted by these contracts. And if they don't obey all the terms of these very complicated contracts, they're sued by the agrochemical companies. Monsanto sues hundreds of farmers for contract infringements. They've even sued farmers when their genes contaminate their fields. Okay. So it's a very oppressive system of control that's taken over agriculture. Now, one of the biggest dangers of genetically modified organisms is the fact that they're made to withstand herbicides. The most common is glyphosate or Roundup. According to Chuck Benbrook, who's the former agriculture chair of the National Academy of Sciences, genetically engineered crops increased the use of herbicides by 122 million pounds, a 15-fold increase between 1994 and 2004. They reduced the prices of these so farmers would buy them, and they kept increasing the amount that was being used, because the more glyphosate, the more herbicide you use, the more super weeds you have, the more resistance you have, and then the stronger chemicals. It's a perfect system when you think about it. You get to sell more and more and more and more of your product. And now, because there's so many super weeds and weeds that are resistant to glyphosate, they're saying, let's use 2,4-D, dicamba, and other more toxic chemicals to control these. This is what they call the pesticide treadmill. It's a trap. There are biological solutions to weeds and pests that are perfectly effective, that have been used and proven by science. So this is not the agriculture that we want. It has enormous consequences for the environment and our personal health. In terms of seeds, so this is another slide to show the rise of super weeds and the rise of use of pesticides on GE crops. And in terms of seeds, these colorful seeds are treated with pesticides. So it's not only in the plants, it's not only sprayed on everything, they treat the seeds themselves. And most of these are treated with nicotinoids, these very powerful new hormone-disrupting toxic chemicals that are killing the bees. Again, we have now also new studies which are showing the monarchs, because the milkweed their food supply has been wiped out by GM agriculture. So again, we have not only this in our own bodies, but in the body of the earth. All around us, we're losing biological diversity, both from the monocropping farming practices and the use of these chemicals. You know about colony collapse disorder? It's much worse now. And part of it is this overuse of these toxic chemicals. It just gets worse. There's so many sources of these chemicals and genetics in our diets and in the food system now. I want to just focus on cereals. and one company that should know better. Because sugar is a big part of the standard American diet. And now 50% of sugar, almost 60 now, 60% of sugar consumed in the United States comes from sugar beets. This is a technology that's only a few years old. Roundup Ready sugar beets are now used to create the sugar supply in this country. And when the sugar beet GMO, mostly Monsanto, went to get approval for their sugar beets, and I'll talk about this approval process in a second, but when they went to get it, they went behind the scenes and were able to get a 5,000% increase in the residues on the sugar beets of glyphosate. So for a while there was a certain level of glyphosate that was allowed in the residue on the foods you eat, but not sugar. Sugar is now 5,000 times more. And for when they use the parts of the sugar beet that don't go into sugar manufacturing, the tolerance is even greater for the amounts for the residues that they use in animal feed. So the animals are being poisoned even more than ourselves. And again, the fields where Roundup is used are deprived of life. Birds, insects, the microbes in the soil, they're all being doused with these toxic chemicals. I'm sorry to tell you, but it's getting even worse. Sorry?
What other cereals?
What other cereals? We'll get to Q&A in a little bit, so yes. But the corn flakes, obviously it's GMO corn, right? It's the frosted corn flakes, GMO sugar on the GMO corn. It's pretty bad. Not that you'd eat them. I know you're health advocates, so you wouldn't eat that, would you? But people do, don't they? So now we have this technology that allows a certain level of control over nature. And whoopee, let's use it on everything is sort of the idea. One of the things you need to understand about biotechnology are patents are the lifeblood of biotechnology. I've mentioned how nature is very generous. It provides for us in all the ways to cope with drought and all the problems and pests. All right, we already have this, we have the information and we have this natural response of the planet to helping us in a healthy way. But we take the genetic engineers take these genes out of the natural world and put them into these products. And the reason they use genetic engineering instead of natural breeding is because you can patent it. They can own it. They can control the marketplace. Okay, so they're taking animals, fish, trees, insects. They're recombining genes from all different species to find different products to put on the market, with all the same consequences that I've been talking about. I also want to mention that it's not just genetic engineering technology that you should be concerned about. We also now have synthetic biology. So genetic engineering is the recombination of species, a bacteria or a fish gene in a strawberry, which if you're a vegan, you should be concerned about, because now you're going to have fish and animal products in your veg. But they recombine what is existing in nature already. Synthetic biology, did you know that you can order DNA online? You can order artificially created organisms? It's all very easy now to do. So synthetic biologists basically create a whole new life form. And now it's in your food supply. There's synthetic vanilla, which is going to put the traditional vanilla farmers out of business. Okay, instead of supporting agriculture and the culture of agriculture, these technologists would rather sell you a product. Let's talk about nanotechnology. These are very, very tiny, tiny particles. They're in sunscreens. Did you know that? When you put them on their skin, they go all through your body. They can go through. It's not like when you eat something, it goes through your digestive system. These things move around in your body through your organs. And there's been a serious concern about nanoparticles in the liver. So there's now nanotechnology in the food supply. And the USDA just approved spending almost $4 million to promote nanotechnology. And in the case of both synthetic biology and nanotechnology, there's no labeling. They haven't been tested for safety. And there's no right for the consumer to say, we don't want this in our food supply. But this is what we're facing now. I want to talk for a second about trees because Genetically engineered trees are very important here in the southeast. Do you know the loblolly pine? It's planted around here very much. It's one of the most productive sources of pulp for paper, and it's planted in tree plantations. So ArborGen, which is a company here in the south, has genetically engineered many trees. This is their catalog here. And the problem is, most of them are being genetically engineered to be Roundup resistant, by the way. But trees are a whole different dynamic, and you talk about it, because we've been talking about annual crops that get harvested, right, and they only last a year. These trees, they're sitting out there for 40 years, exuding the GMO pollen year after year after year, impacting the soil, impacting the wildlife, impacting water. And pollen is a common allergy, right, for a lot of people. One study done on the long-distance dispersal of pollen in the spring showed that there were millions of pounds of pollen given off from these pine trees, and it can travel 1,800 miles. They've also found viable pollen 2,000 feet in the air. So how will this GM pollen affect human health and the environment? Again, the USDA approved genetically engineered trees, these particular pines, rubber stamped them, and they're being allowed to be planted here. So let's look up for a second. Are genetically engineered organisms being regulated or not? As a former USDA lawyer, I can say they're not. I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. But basically, the basic premise that you need to understand, because the industry tries to tell you they're safe, and this slide shows you that there's this finger pointing going on, okay, where the industry says, no, the government's proving it, and the government says, no, the industry's responsibility. But it's a voluntary system, so the USDA or the FDA or the EPA, those are the three agencies that are involved, they're only told what the industry tells them. There's no independent analysis. There's nothing going on that ever questions what the industry tells them. So how did this happen? Several key components are bad legal decisions. The courts are pretty much biologically illiterate, so they're just rubber stamping, again, what the industry tells them. There's been the capitulation of scientists, and from my standpoint, one of the worst problems is a complacent media who never questions what they're told about these products and this information. But one moment, and I go over all these stories in my book, I talk about a very important decision that the U.S. Supreme Court made okaying the patenting of the living organisms. You're not supposed to have patents on life forms. Come on, that just violates common sense as well as the whole idea of what patents were originally created to do for us, which was to protect our creativity. No, you don't patent life. But how'd that happen? Well, a key decision in the Supreme Court was made by Clarence Thomas, who was a former Monsanto lawyer. He should have recused himself. But the industry was very clever. They brought a case by Pioneer, DuPont, rather than Monsanto, so he didn't have to recuse himself, and he could be the deciding judge to patent life forms. There are many other decisions by the Supreme Court and other courts that have validated this corruption that we've been talking about. But the story that really stands out in my mind was in 1986, 4 Monsanto executives went to the White House when Reagan was president and sat down, and they created the regulatory system we have. And basically what they said, they all agreed, it's called the Coordinated Framework. It was announced later when George Bush, who was vice president at the time, became president, George I. When he became president, his vice president then carried out this deregulatory program. And they said there are going to be no new laws. So even though this is a revolutionary science, I always say it's not science, revolutionary technology, changing everything, there wouldn't be any new laws governing it. And there wouldn't be any new science. So we're using science based on chemicals to evaluate the impact of genetics on these living organisms. And this was a deal that was made with industry. They left just enough regulation in place. You know the story about the lights are on but nobody's home? That's what you need to think about with these agencies. It appears and it makes the industry say, oh, there's something going on, but it's not. So along with the political control came the corruption of science. Okay, and I've talked a little bit about the stories. There's many, many stories, some in my book and others you may have heard of, where basically independent science is not allowed into this critique of how this system works. What we have is what I call the best science that money can buy. An important part of this is the control of the university system. You know, I talk a lot with university agriculture professors, and they say the students would love to study sustainable farming, but there's no money for it. All the money that the universities have now are coming from the biotech corporations, and they're controlling the research agenda. That's especially true in Hawaii right now, which is the ground zero for GM agriculture. This is where all the seeds are grown that are being farmed in the Middle West. Most of them come from Hawaii. Now all the big companies are there because you have 3 growing seasons, okay? And I did a study of Hawaii of GM contamination of the fields there. This is a photograph. They just leave the GM corn out and then birds eat it and it's just left out in the ground. Their field practice are abysmal. And in fact, Hawaii finally, this is kind of an old slide, I did this years ago, but they just won a case against Pioneer because the other thing you need to know about Hawaii is they have like 2 to 3 growing seasons a year, right? So they're spraying 2 and 3 times a year more than they do in the Midwest in here. And so there's more and more and more chemicals, and there are experimental chemicals being used there. And the dust from that is going into everyone's home and making them sick and getting them sick in the schools. And they just won their lawsuit in Kauai and their Pioneer was fined for making people who live around their farms ill. And they also had been successful in getting a local law saying that these GM companies needed to report with their use of pesticides. But then Syngenta goes in and sued the county of Kauai to say, no, you can't do that. So the county, Gary Hooser, he went to Switzerland to the Syngenta meeting recently and he said, how dare you sue us for the right to poison us and our families and children? When Switzerland, you don't use these chemicals here in your own home country. But you're suing us for the right to use them on us and our children in our fields. I could talk a lot about the contamination problems, but again, it's pretty well established. The one thing I want to leave you with is that it's intentional. Like I've said, they actually in Hawaii, they give GM seeds to the school kids to plant in their school gardens. You know, so as the quote here at the bottom admits, the industry pretty much admits they want to impose this in the system. They want GM everywhere, so we no longer have a choice. This pretty much shows the situation in Hawaii. And the silencing, another friend of mine, Hector Valenzuela. It's a great story which I can give you a link to, or you can just look it up. But again, his university, which has been attacking him, is taking money from Monsanto. So if we're really honest about this, we're going to have to also, I think, admit our own role in allowing this to happen. We're living in a really distracted world, aren't we? You know, where entertainment has taken the place of information. Right? So I want to encourage you to try and get in that other line there. Try and sign up for the inconvenient truths. And also to engage in the political process. As the poet Wendell Berry says, the time has come. Let me ask you guys, is the situation bad enough that you'd like to see it change? Yes, right. Once you really have the courage to face how bad it is and how far we've come along on this process, I think that we can finally say, I'm going to get busy. Not just our own personal health, but the political aspects of this have to change. And one speaker yesterday, I think it was, said something really interesting. He said that the problem is we're organized around a false narrative. I completely agree. And then he said but I don't know what to do about it. Well, I think I do, and that is change the narrative. Let's change the story we're telling ourselves. This is why stories are so important. Let's change the story we're telling ourselves. And one thing I know about being a storyteller is that you get to decide how the story ends. So if we change the story, we can change how this is going to come out, right? How do we retell the story of agriculture? The first thing we need to do is think about how it's been told to us. You know, GMOs are always sold as something you need because of some scary pest or scary disease or scary problems, right? It's all a fear-based scarcity. It kind of goes back to that being kicked out of the garden and being told, you know, we're going to have to suffer, right? So the level of awareness that we have about ourselves as well as the world is an issue we have to look at. And the other thing that I've learned is that we don't really ask the right questions. When genetic engineers decided that they wanted, this is a scientist who helped develop BT, or recombinant BT told me this. She's a reformed scientist. She's actually very much in opposition to this technology. She told me that genetic engineers only ask one question: does it work? That's all they want to know. They want to know, they're engineers. They're going to go from point A to point B. They're not biologists. They're not ecologists. They're not even just human beings concerned about their health. So the question that we need to ask is, what else does it do? Sure, we can make it work, but what else does it do? And we're not asking that question, just as an example. I'd also like to give a shout out for common sense. We know this is wrong. We intuitively understand this situation is not good for us. And yet, you know, we seem to be really impelled to passivity, and I'm not quite sure why that is. But let me tell you one more story. When I grew up in the Bay Area, this is where my mom and I used to go and get apricots and cherries and fruit that we'd can in the summer. It was called the Valley of Heart's Delight, just south of San Francisco. And this is what it's today. The Valley of Heart's Delight is now Silicon Valley. And doesn't that just sum up the difference between where we were and where we are now? Hasn't that long ago. It was not that long ago. But clearly technology has run so far and so fast ahead, it hasn't kept up with our humanity, with ethics, with morality, even with just basic science. Which brings us back to this question: how are we going to feed ourselves? And I say the question itself is the one I want to just give you here. How do we feed ourselves? Not how are we going to be fed? It's important to retain the right to feed yourself as an essential human right. And there's important science behind this point. I love science. This slide just represents, I want to say that I really love science. It's really helpful. It's like Gandhi said about civilization: I wish there was more of it. I wish there was more science involved in this. But the issue of technology is very important, because technology is important to agriculture productivity and health. And so the biotech industry, along with the United Nations and the World Bank, got together and they asked this question: what is the optimal technology for science and development in agriculture? And so they got 800 stakeholders. Just think of the size of the story, including biotech and NGOs, 400 selected experts. I've interviewed some of them. And then 110 countries in a multidisciplinary, multi-year study all over the world. It was the most extensive worldwide study on agriculture ever done. It looked at this issue of technology in agriculture from every possible angle. And it was endorsed when it was done by 58 countries in the world. So I highly recommend that you look up IAASTD and you read the executive summary, because I can only have a minute to tell you what they found. But basically, they found that genetically modified organisms are not only not the answer, they're causing more harm than good, even the good that the companies are selling it for. What they say is that agroecology methods of agriculture, the ones we know to be productive and also have the culture of agriculture preserved and clean water and clean soil, that these local and traditional and regional agricultural practices that have sustained humanity for 10,000 years, that's what we need to keep doing, and we need to support that with the knowledge and with the progress we've had. We're not talking about going backwards. We're talking about appropriate technology and optimal use. Well, why haven't you heard of IASTD, I want to know? Has anybody here heard of it before I told you? You know why? Because it came out wrong. So the biotech industry has covered it up, and the media goes along with that. I just want to briefly mention that this is the kind of agriculture, just to give you a different picture of it. Again, women are a very important part of this picture. Local seeds, local knowledge. And science is a very important part of productivity and health in agriculture. Now, this is a recent report that's very important. You can Google SRI. What happened was, you probably heard about the Green Revolution. Well, basically the Green Revolution was all about reforming, using natural breeding, to plants, especially rice, to take more herbicides and fertilizers. So it was produced by the chemical companies. I have the story of how this happens in my book. It was the Green Revolution was about starting to use chemical fertilizers in agriculture. And yes, they got more productivity from that, but there were many environmental and social consequences to that. These farmers in India developed something called SRI, which involves a planting method, where they have been able to vastly increase the productivity of agriculture. And it's called the most significant development in the past 50 years for the world's small-scale farmers. Most of the world still feeds itself from small-scale farmers. And in California, I can tell you, we're back to that. And we have, in my county now, local agriculture. We basically have our own agriculture, and it's mostly organic. And we're saving the soil, we're saving the water, we're giving fair wages to the farm workers, and we're ridding ourselves of this chemical dependency. It can be done. And here's some examples of mostly grass-fed agriculture in Marin. And we're teaming up with science to validate the carbon capture of using composting that takes the minerals in the soil and captures the carbon. And we're validating that. So the farmers are not only able to provide more food and healthier water and make more profit, they're also contributing to reducing climate change. So these are the multiple benefits of agriculture done right. And I must say that NAFTA and GATT and all these free trade agreements are very adamant about eradicating the multiple benefits of agriculture and focusing only on corporate industrial monocultures. So these free trade agreements are one way to oppose what we don't want to have happen. The other thing I really love that's happening are seed banks. Probably your local library or something in your community, like my community, is doing something really good to bring back the kind of agriculture we want. I love seed libraries. These are your local library where you go to get your books. Now a lot of them have seed lending libraries, which are bringing back our ability to grow things for ourselves in the areas where we live. So I really encourage anything you can do to stop the criminalization and restriction of seeds. But I'd also like to say, have some fun. Get the artists, get the poets, get the music, get the community together to do this work. It's not something we can do by ourselves. It's something that can unite us in our communities and where we live. We need a new model. The good thinking about this is we have to change, but we need a new model for change. So I want to go back to the Garden of Eden for a moment. Some people think that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because they ate of the fruit of the forbidden tree. Go back and read the story. I looked at all the versions of the Bible I could find, and that's not actually what happened. There were two trees in the Garden of Eden: the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And what God says is, the way the story goes in the Bible is, it says, you're out of here because you blew it, but the reason I'm kicking you out of the garden is to prevent something from happening. I'm going to prevent you from having access to the tree of life. And the ending of the story is, in that story, there was an army of angels and a flaming, twirling sword in front of the tree of life. And the tree of life is such an important part of all of our stories of humanity. Every culture practically has a tree of life story. And many people have suggested that the tree of life is the double helix DNA. And this is a warning in that creation story that life is sacred and to stay away from manipulating this double helix from the DNA. Now I want to close with a couple of things. I want to talk for a second about other creation stories, because I want to suggest this as one of the models. There are many, many creation stories in the world, and there's another model. And with your permission, and I'll be available for questions afterwards too, but I want to read you a story with your permission, because my friend Robin Kimmerer, who's a Native American scientist and educator, wrote a beautiful story in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about herb plant traditions. And she tells the story of Sky Woman falling, which I think really helps us learn what we need to know. So I'm going to read it to you. Just take 2 minutes. This is a beautiful Oneida artist that did the story illustration. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below. But in that emptiness, there were many eyes looking back up at her. They saw a small object, like a mere dust mote, in the light beam. As it grew closer, they could see it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind her as she spiraled down towards them. The geese nodded to one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath her to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward. And so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for so much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated up in their midst and offered his back for her to rest on. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home, and they discussed how they might bring that to her. So all the animals, to shorten the story, went down, and they all tried to dive down and get some earth for her and bring it back up for her, because in her hand she had grabbed onto the tree of life just before she fell, and she held the seeds of the tree of life in her hand. And all the otter and the beaver and the sturgeon, the fish, they all went down and they were unable to do it, until finally the muskrat was left. And the muskrat, who was the weakest diver of all, said, "I'm going to try." And he goes down, and he was gone for a really, really long time. And nothing happened, and everybody waited. And finally some bubbles came up, and the muskrat came up, and he had died. But in his little claws, he clutched some soil. He gave his life for this, but they were able to take it out of his paw and spread it on the back of the turtle. And she danced with such gratitude for having some soil. She danced and danced and danced on the back of the turtle and created the land we now know as the earth that we live on. And she was moved by these extraordinary gifts, and she sang in thanksgiving. And the land grew, and she was able to plant the seeds that she'd carried with them. And together, all of them had formed what we now know as Turtle Island. I know. What if we had that creation story to carry us forward? What if we were really able to understand the abundance, the cooperation of species? I love the part where they called council, where they said, how can we do this together? I love that part. I love the part about how the species cooperated. I have a friend who says what we need are natural strategies to inform our social strategies. There's so much that nature can teach us. I'm going to close with a part of my book where I close my book with the same words about seeds. Seeds are the messengers for the past. They are an embodiment of hope for the future. Seeds are a promise of life to come. They endure because they're generous. They survive by being resilient, abundant, and adaptable. The story of seeds is also our story. We can be guided by the way of seeds and by knowing that what we do to ourselves, we do to seeds. I think that the most important thing that we need to do is to value beauty, value abundance, and value each other as we reconnect to the natural integrity of the world. Thank you.